Greetings, Mr. Portnikov. I am glad to see you again in good health. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Hello? Mr. Portnikov, well, this diplomatic hype around the idea of ending the war that Russia has unleashed against Ukraine is acquiring, well, let's say, new facets, shades, dimensions, which are largely related to domestic political trends in the United States. As far as this is linearly interconnected, all the more so suddenly Trump demanded, or rather saw defects in democracy in Ukraine. Demanded elections. Ukraine takes this pass and gives it back, says, there is no problem to ensure peace. There will be elections for you. And then what? Please. Well, I would like to remind you that this is not the first time Trump talks about the lack of democracy in Ukraine. At the first stage of his presidency, when he generally had quite significant, serious illusions about mutual understanding with Vladimir Putin, he called the Ukrainian president a dictator, not noticing, however, that such definitions can first of all be betrayed in relation to the President Russia, which, as is known, rules the country primarily due to total control over society, but not only. We perfectly remember the atmosphere in which the constitutional changes were adopted, which allowed Putin to be at the head of state for almost unlimited time. But nevertheless, it is obvious that Trump always raises the topic of the Ukrainian elections when he wants to put pressure on the Ukrainian leadership, and when he again has illusions about the possibility of agreements with the Russian one. And I believe that this shows all the amazing illogic and incompetence of both the President of the United States himself and those people who surround him and do not dare to tell the truth to Trump about the world in which the American president lives together with his associates and supporters. Because to date, there are no signs that the leadership of the Russian Federation is ready to end the Russian-Ukrainian war at all. Shortly before our conversation, I listened to the speech of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, with which he addressed the heads of diplomatic missions. And in this speech, Lavrov clearly indicates that Russia is going to continue to achieve the so-called goals of special operations. Moreover, in this speech, there is already a direct threat of war in Europe. Yes, of course, Lavrov, out of habit, let's say, inherent in Russian leaders since the beginning of the 25th year, says compliments to Trump on duty, claims that there is mutual understanding between the Russian leadership and Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff. By the way, it is interesting that he does not even mention Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner in this regard. But there is no desire to compromise. So I always have a question. So the pressure on Zelensky was crowned with success. Ukraine has agreed to certain demands of the United States, which, in particular, relate to the retreat of Ukrainian troops. Firm that part of the territory of the Donetsk region, in which the control of the Zhu and the neutral status of Ukraine remain, and Ukraine's refusal to prosecute war criminals and murderers, with whom the President of the United States is going to cooperate for profit and benefit, together with members of his families, representatives of the immediate environment. And the President of the Russian Federation clearly says the President of the United States that he is not satisfied with these conditions. What will Trump do next? Then, what is the point of all this pressure, except to demonstrate that the only tools available to the President of the United States in foreign policy are the tools of brute force? It's not just about us. We see that any country whose leadership, for objective or biased reasons, criticizes the absolutely incompetent and incompetent foreign policy of the current presidential administration of the United States, is constantly under pressure or economic pressure for readiness to enter into an economic war or direct threats by force. The use of force. And in this sense, it can be clearly said that Donald Trump is the political twin of Vladimir Putin, who is restrained solely by those democratic institutions that exist in the United States, and which, I still hope, will win a decisive victory over the head of the American state if he tries to start these institutions. Mr. Portnikov, it is important to understand another such aspect here. Just the day before, a poll was published in the United States, where, in general, support for Ukraine is an idea that is supported by the majority of American citizens, well, at least according to this poll. Whereas Trump, who is extremely susceptible to public sentiment. Moreover, populism for him is quite such an everyday tool of his, well, such political positioning goes against the expectations of society. What is the reason for this in your opinion? You understand what's going on. I completely agree with you when we say that Donald Trump is susceptible to public sentiment. Yes, and I always say that in the Ukraine, Trump, and representative of his entourage, the nearest at least. I'm not talking about all the members of the administration. We have seen different positions on the part of Secretary of State Mark Ruby, on the part of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. And this is different from the position we hear from Steve Witkoff, for example. Nevertheless, it is clear that, on the whole, the president and his inner circle are in an obvious minority. This is an immutable fact. However, there is another question, which is also a way to remember. Foreign policy issues usually do not have special meanings when talking about elections in the United States. These are questions of the third or fourth field. You and I know how Americans vote. We have seen a lot, so to speak, of elections in the United States. Yes, for many elections monitored. And it would be possible to make sure that Americans are interested in foreign policy problems, unfortunately, in the last place. Yes, they can support Ukraine. They may think that the position of the administration is inadequate. But they will primarily monitor the prices at gas stations, their own lives, what is happening with their salaries, the unemployment rate. And this will remain the main priority in their voting. So there is always a very good question. To what extent will Trump consider that the fact that his administration does not support the issue of Ukraine is an important point when it comes to by-elections to Congress? To what extent the voters themselves will vote for a congressional candidate based on foreign policy considerations? We understand perfectly well that in the American outback, what is happening in the Russian-Ukrainian war is a very distant war. Even the war in the Middle East interests Americans much more, and because it is much more highlighted by the media. And because there is a large Jewish community, because there is, by the way, a large community of immigrants from the Middle East. And look, on the one hand, one could say that these are voters, and this is very important, but on the other hand, American Jews, as a rule, vote for the Democrats, despite the fact that Donald Trump has always positioned himself as a strong supporter of Israel. That is, it did not force them to change the party. Just like the American evangelicals who support Israel, they have always voted for Republicans, and would hardly have voted for Democrats if the Biden administration's position on what is happening in Gaza, was, different in the direction of their own understanding of what is happening in the region. Therefore, this is the number one problem. Yes, American society as a whole is absolutely adequate, but on a secondary, unfortunately, issue. And I have a question that I just don't know the answer to myself yet. As far as the administration can ignore these sentiments. Well, we see alarm bells. Here are the same elections in Miami, there are the same polls, where there is a very low level of approval of Trump's policies among voters. Isn't that what this is about? No, I think it's primarily about the economy. No, I mean exactly what you're saying. How much can he ignore? He can ignore this, especially ahead. Foreign policy issues can be ignored. I say again, voters who do not support Trump may not support him for completely different reasons. The vast majority of people in the American outback do not know where Ukraine or Armenia is located. Unless, of course, it is not a Ukrainian, not an Armenian, not a native of the territory of the former Soviet Union. Or I do not know they're from Lebanon. For him, it will all be absolutely some white dots on a distant map. That's the point. Therefore, yes, Republican support is falling, but opinion polls do not show that it is falling due to the fact that Trump is taking the wrong position on Ukraine. You can refer to Trump's interview with the politician's publication. Yes, where 2/3 of the text is devoted to Ukraine. The journalist constantly talks to him about Ukraine, once again about Ukraine, and for the third time, about Putin's Ukraine, and the fifth. And then suddenly he says to him, I talked to your supporter, who voted for you and is ready to vote further. And she says, unfortunately, the economic situation is very bad so far. In the economic? He doesn't say, I talked to your supporter, and she is not very happy with your approach to Ukraine, because for this supporter, there is no Ukraine. She voted for Trump, hoping to improve first of all her own life. So, the vast majority of the voters of the United States of America vote. Therefore, I repeat once again, I do not know how much Trump's position on Ukraine will affect the positions of voters in the congressional and presidential elections for 2028 year. But I guess there's no way. Mr. Portnikov, it will soon be a year without a month since Trump is President of the United States. And during this time, it so happened that Europe and Ukraine began to speak with a single consolidated position regarding both support for Ukraine, the introduction of war, and the negotiation process. And soon there will be another such conversation between the big three of Europe and Trump. What can this lead to? Or again, everything will be like running on the spot. Please. Well, again, it is clear why Europe supports Ukraine now. Because this is a matter of our common security on the European continent. And because more and more people in Europe understand how serious the threat from Russia is to European security. And this is now the number one question without any doubt. And of course, in Europe, would not want to end the Russo-Ukrainian war, and many of these conditions exist in Russia, felt that they could move on. But at the same time, I say again, Trump may agree with European leaders, he may disagree. By the way, at the time of our conversation, as far as I understand, his conversation with the European Troika had already taken place. Trump himself said that he passed in harsh tones. But there is another question no less important. And what's the point of all this exchange of opinions if the war can't be ended anyway? I understand that if Trump and Eurotroika talked about the conditions for the end of the war. But first of all, they are not talking about the conditions for the end of the war, but about what may really be interesting to the President of the United States in his illusions about the end of the war. But again, we must understand that without Europe, the war to end too is impossible. Because when the United States looks forward to the lifting of sanctions against Russia or the use of the Russian frozen assets, it still may not be the decision of Washington. It should be a joint decision of the Americans and the Europeans. Mr. Portnikov, just the day before, a Republican congressman introduced a bill on the withdrawal of the United States from NATO, stating at the same time that NATO was created to confront the Soviet Union, which has not existed for 3 decades or more. It doesn't make sense. America is wasting money there. I have such a question. Is it from ignorance and misunderstanding of the situation, or, well, just such propaganda is being conducted for completely different reasons? That is, such a misunderstanding in quotation marks. Yes, it is intentional. You know, the last thing we should do is to analyze the initiative of individual congressmen. There are hundreds of congressmen. They are taking steps that, again, are designed to draw attention to them. If you can't achieve any initiative that will be important to you as a successful politician, to whom the media is paying attention, you can take some extravagant step, and then everyone will write to you like this congressman. Although again, I repeat, when it comes to elections to the House of Representatives, the voters of this congressman will pay attention, not to his initiatives regarding withdrawal from NATO, but to how much life has really improved in the district where he lives, and what he has done for this. And it definitely shouldn't be a decision on the withdrawal of the United States from NATO. Therefore, the initiative of someone in the American House of Representatives, on issues that relate primarily to the responsibility of the administration of the President of the United States. This is pure white noise. If indeed someone in the United States decided to take seriously the idea of withdrawing from NATO, such a bill would be initiated at the level of the President of the United States. At least it would be taken seriously by the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And so we just let another political conman just talk about him in the American media in order to get some political capital, at least fame and mentions before the by-election. This only means that the election campaign for the elections to the US Congress does not begin after the Christmas holidays, but before. Mr. Portnikov in Ukraine, here is the Mindic Gate, yes, this corruption scandal, and well, part of the American press writes that, and so we said that there is no need to get involved, everyone is stealing there, and so on. But at the same time, it is Ukraine itself that has exposed this corruption and intends to do so further, to clean the state apparatus of this rust. Whereas there are no complaints about Russian corruption, where corruption is not just a phenomenon, but just a management system. It is of a total nature, and is the meaning of the existence of this entire vertical of power. About the elections. Well, bad democracy in Ukraine, you see, that there have been no elections for a long time, but there are elections in Russia. That is, some kind of selective discontent and selective satisfaction. This is again my question the same. Is it just firm misunderstanding, or is it done intentionally? Well, of course intentionally. Trump understands everything perfectly. This is a typical policy when friends are everything, enemies are the law. And, without any doubt, the corruption risks for the Ukrainian state and society are quite large. Yes, everything is beyond any doubt, everyone understands this in Ukraine. The incompetent system of public administration, which was the result of the statement of the Ukrainian people, increases corruption risks at times. Because where there is incompetence, leadership, there is an opportunity for all sorts of scammers and people close to the feeder to profit from money in a suite, so even this no one can understand. But really, you are right, those anti-corruption bodies that were created in our country during the period when the politicians of the so-called maiden parties were in power. This is the so-called time of building Ukrainian statehood 2014-2019 year. Many observers call it a decisive time of reform of Ukraine's progress along the path of European integration and Euro-Atlantic solidarity. These bodies, which have become the legacy of these short-lived, but very important 5 post-revolutionary years after the Maidan, they effectively, as you can see, fight corruption and, moreover, are not afraid to enter even the offices of the closest employees and associates of the current president of the country. Imagine a similar situation in Vladimir Putin's inner circle. But we have again seen Trump's interview with the publication Politician, where he is outraged by drug cartels in Venezuela, expresses quite harsh warnings against the president of this country, Nicolas Maduro. And I believe that these are absolutely sound warnings, and Trump is absolutely right when he talks about the usurpation of Maduro's power, and that the Maduro regime and Chavez turned Venezuela into a real big drug cartel with distressed people. But at the same time, the journalist asks Trump why he pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was the organizer of exactly the same drug cartel and served his time in an American prison. And Trump pretends that he did it precisely because there were abuses by the previous Democratic administration. As if the Democratic administration, unlike the Republican one, should not fight the drug cartel. But in fact, we understand perfectly well that this move by Trump was connected with his desire to help the victory of an ultra-right populist candidate in the presidential elections in Honduras. And he really increased the rating of this candidate so much that now he is close to victory. It's just that a recount of votes is taking place in Honduras in the presidential election. But voters' sympathies are almost half divided there, although before Trump's decision, the far-right candidate had no real chances. Trump supports far-right, I would say post-fascist leaders around the world. In Europe, in Latin America. This notorious Argentine president ultra-popular Mile, the Prime Minister of Hungary Orban. And as we see, when it comes to corruption abuses or even drug trafficking in regimes that ideologically impress the platform of American post-fascists and the far right, Trump is absolutely calmly ready to turn a blind eye to this. The same goes for Russia. I have already said that ideologically Trumpism and Trump supporters are the same as Putinism and Putin supporters. Therefore, naturally, not holding elections in the Russian Federation, while maintaining ultra-right post-fascist political rule there, is much closer to the President of the United States of America than any other regimes resisting the onslaught of these authorities and ideology. I will not call, as you understand, the government that exists in Ukraine liberal. It would also be an exaggeration, to put it mildly. Vladimir Zelensky did not come to power under any left-wing or radical slogans that could allow him to draw a parallel between him and the mayor of New York, Ma'am Dane, with whom Trump recently met and, by the way, was very enthusiastic. But the main fault of Vladimir Zelensky and Ukraine before Trump is that Ukraine is resisting the Putin regime, ideologically related to the current American administration. That's the whole answer to the question. This is the closeness of the ideology of the traditional pseudo-value of the Khanate, the willingness to wrap business interest in a false wrapper. Do you understand? Solidarity of the bigwigs who perceive the state as a cover for solving their own problems. It is close to Putin, who turned Russia is actually in their own possession, and Trump, who views the United States primarily as a mechanism for the enrichment of his own family entourage. And in conclusion, Mr. Portnikov, it's like looking out of a tree, but seeing what is happening, it is absolutely natural that Armenia institutionally strengthens its ties with countries that we consider like-minded people and associations. In particular, with the European Union. Just the day before, a new strategic agenda of Armenia's EU relations was signed. This is a 64-page document. And a few days later, just the day before, Armenia and Germany became strategic partners, and Berlin also, well, pledged to comply with Armenia's European integration. In your opinion, how does this affect the balance of power in our region and trends in general? How does it affect trends in the post-Soviet space? Please. From a geopolitical point of view, we should all be interested in the fact that Greater Europe, both here in the east of the continent and in the South Caucasus, has replaced the pernicious post-Soviet influence. Because this is a question of the normal life of our countries and our peoples who have the right to a civilized life and to their own control over their own power, because this is actually what distinguishes Europe from the post-Soviet world. Neither in Russia, nor in Belarus, nor in most of the other Soviet republics, citizens cannot influence the election of their own authorities in any way. Who from the former Soviet republics, if we do not talk about the Baltic states, that left the Soviet Union, at the time of its existence, can really say that he votes and does not know the future result of the elections. These countries are well known. This is Ukraine, this is the Republic of Moldova, this is Armenia. And, by the way, until recently, it was Georgia and Kyrgyzstan. As you can see, now the number of these countries is not increasing, unfortunately, but decreasing. And in this sense, we should congratulate the Director of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation, Comrade Portnikov, and the Director of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation, Comrade Narishka, on her successful work. But we are not interested in their successful work, we are interested in the failure of these imposter sterlets. Therefore, it is very important for us that we take the path that we have to take in relation to Europe, so that we pass it. And I am sure that this will also help our neighbors in the regions to return to the state in which a civilized person should be, who has the right to choose, to participate in the choice. And this applies to all the countries of the South Caucasus, because I am absolutely sure that only the democratic development of these states, each of which had its own important democratic experience, will help stability in the region. There is never peace between authoritarian regimes for a long time. And this applies to Eastern Europe. I very much hope that the normal development of Ukraine and our success in preserving statehood will help the Belarusian people to free themselves from the occupation regime that was imposed in this country during the successful operation of the FSB of the Russian Federation in 1994 and beyond. And most importantly, it will save the Belarusian people because before our eyes, unfortunately, the history of the Belarusian people is coming to an end now, and it simply becomes part of the Russian. And if we manage to defend our statehood and help Belarusians return to the European continent and become part of the common space that we have always been with them before the destruction of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a whole, then the Ukrainian people will then render such an invaluable service to the Belarusian people, pulling it out of the teeth of a greedy and vile dragon, the neighborhood. Thank you very much, Mr. Portnikov is very important for your comments and ratings you've shared with our viewers, and taking the time our airwaves. Take care of yourself. See you soon. Glory to Ukraine. Have a nice day. Heroes of glory, good luck.